the patterns of life. A few years ago, an 83-year-old man wrote one of the most touching letters I have ever received from a reader. After World War I, he wrote, he had been a soldier in the field artillery stationed in the South. They used horses to pull the gun carriages, and after maneuvers they often unhitched them and played games of polo. During those games he felt an exhilaration that he had never felt before or after. He assumed that only playing polo could make him feel so good. The next 60 years were routine and uneventful. Then he read Flow, and realized that the thrill he had experienced as a young man on horseback was not necessarily limited to the game of polo, and began to do some things he thought might be fun to do, but never tried. He took up gardening, listening to music, and other activities that, lo and behold, revived the excitement of his youth. It is good that in his 80s, this man had discovered that he need not accept passively a boring life. Still, the intervening 60 years seem to have been unnecessarily barren. And how many people never realize that they can shape their psychic energy so as to get the most out of experience? If the finding that about 15% of the population are never in flow is accurate, that means that just in this country, tens of millions of people are depriving themselves of what makes life worth living. Of course, in many cases, one can well understand why a person may experience flow rarely or not at all. A deprived childhood, abusive parents, poverty, and a host of other external reasons may make it difficult for a person to find joy in everyday life. On the other hand, there are so many examples of individuals who overcame such obstacles that the belief that the quality of life is determined from the outside is hardly tenable. Some of the most vocal disagreements to what I have written about flow came from readers who claimed to have been abused, and who wanted me to know that contrary to what I had said, it was perfectly possible for abused children to enjoy their adult lives. Examples are too many to mention. One of my favorites involves Antonio Gramsci, the philosopher of humanistic socialism that had such a strong influence on the development of European thought in this century, and on the eventual demise of Leninism-Stalinism. Born in 1891, to a destitute family on the poor island of Sardinia, Antonio had a deformed spine and was sickly all through childhood. Their poverty became almost intolerable when his father, arrested on false charges, was imprisoned and could no longer support his large family. In an unsuccessful attempt to cure his hunchback, Antonio's uncle would hang the child by his ankles from the rafters of the hovel in which they lived. Antonio's mother was so sure that the child was eventually going to pass away in his sleep that every night she set out his one good suit and a pair of candles on the dresser so that the funeral preparations would take less time. Given these facts, it would have come as no surprise that Gramsci grew up full of hatred and spite. Instead, he dedicated his life to helping the oppressed by becoming a subtle writer and brilliant theoretician. Although one of the founders of the Italian Communist Party, he never compromised his humanitarian values for the sake of expediency or party dogma. Even after Mussolini had him imprisoned in a medieval jail so that he would die in solitary confinement, he kept writing letters and essays full of light, hope, and compassion. All of the external factors conspired to twist Gramsci's life. He must take all the credit for achieving the intellectual and emotional harmony that he left as his heritage. Another example from my own research this time concerns the life of Linus Pauling. He was born in Portland, Oregon at the turn of the century. His father died when Linus was 9 years old, leaving the family impoverished. Although he was an omnivorous reader and collected minerals, plants, and insects, Linus did not think he would go past high school. Fortunately, the parents of one of his friends almost forced him to enroll in college. Then he received a scholarship to get into Caltech, became involved in research, was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1954, and the Nobel Peace Prize in 1962. He describes his college years as follows. I made a little money by odd jobs, working for the college, killing dandelions on the lawn by dipping a stick in a bucket containing sodium arsenate solution, and then stabbing the stick into the dandelion plant. Every day I chopped wood, a quarter of a cord perhaps, into lengths, they were already sawed, into a size that would go into the wood-burning stoves in the girls' dormitory. Twice a week I cut up a quarter of a beef into steaks or roasts, and every day I mopped the big kitchen, the very large kitchen area. Then at the end of my sophomore year, I got a job as a paving engineer, laying blacktop pavement in the mountains of southern Oregon. What was so amazing about Linus Pauling is that even at 90 years of age, he kept the enthusiasm and curiosity of a young child. Everything he did or said was bubbling with energy. Despite the early adversity and the later hardships, he exuded an obvious joie de vivre. And there was no secret about how he did it. In his own words, I just went ahead doing what I like to do. Some will find such an attitude irresponsible. How can someone afford the self-indulgence of doing only what he likes to do? But the point is that Poling, and the many others who share his attitude, like to do almost everything, no matter how difficult or trivial, including the things they are forced to do. The only thing they definitely don't like is wasting time. So it is not that their life is objectively better than yours or mine, but that their enthusiasm for it is such that most of what they do ends up providing them with flow experiences. Recently, there has been a lot written about how people are born either with a happy or a sad temperament, and there is not that much one can do to change it. If you happen to be a happy person, you will stay that way no matter how much bad luck you encounter. If you're not, a strike of good luck may lift your mood for a short while, but you will soon return to the lukewarm, average moroseness doomed by the genes. If this were true, then it would be hopeless to try changing the quality of one's life. But this deterministic scenario is correct only insofar as the extroverted exuberance that is often mistaken for happiness is concerned. That seems indeed to be a fairly stable trait of a person's character. It is a different story, however, if, by happiness, we mean the less obvious enjoyment of life that flow provides. In a rare ESM longitudinal study of teenagers, for instance, Joel Heckner found that about 60% of the adolescents reported the same frequency of flow over a 1-week period measured 2 years apart. Those who had much of it earlier still had it later, and those who had little earlier had little 2 years later. But the remaining 40% changed over the same period, half reporting significantly more flow, measured as high-challenge, high-skill experiences, and half less. Those whose frequency of flow increased 2 years later spent more time studying and less in passive leisure, and their levels of concentration, self-esteem, enjoyment, and interest was significantly higher than that of the teenagers whose frequency of flow decreased, although 2 years earlier the two groups had reported the same quality of experience. It is important to note that the teens whose flow increased did not report being happier than the ones who decreased, but because of the great differences in the other dimensions of experience, it is safe to conclude that the happiness reported by the low-flow group was more shallow and less authentic. This suggests that it is indeed possible to improve the quality of one's life by investing psychic energy in activities that are more likely to produce flow. Because for most of us a job is such a central part of life, it is essential that this activity be as enjoyable and rewarding as possible. Yet many people feel that as long as they get decent pay and some security, it doesn't matter how boring or alienating their job is. Such an attitude, however, amounts to throwing away almost 40% of one's waking life. And since no one else is going to take the trouble of making sure we enjoy our work, it makes sense for each of us to take on this responsibility. Generally, there are 3 main reasons that jobs are resented. The first is that the job is pointless. It does no good to anyone, and in fact, it may be harmful. Some government employees, high-pressure salesmen, and even scientists working in fields like armaments or the tobacco industry have to engage in some heavy denial to tolerate what they do for a living. The second reason is that the work is boring and routine. It provides no variety or challenge. After a few years, one can do it in one's sleep, and all it provides is a feeling of stagnation rather than growth. The third problem with jobs is that they are often stressful, especially when one can't get along with one's supervisor or colleagues who expect too much or do not recognize one's contributions. Contrary to popular opinion, concerns for more money and security are usually not as important as these 3 in determining whether one will be satisfied with one's job or not. Even if we don't want to admit it, the ability to overcome most obstacles is within our hands. We can't blame family, society, or history if our work is meaningless, dull, or stressful. Admittedly, there are not too many options when we realize that our job is useless or actually harmful. Perhaps the only choice is to quit as quickly as possible, even at the cost of severe financial hardship. In terms of the bottom line of one's life, it is always a better deal to do something one feels good about than something that may make us materially comfortable but emotionally miserable. Such decisions are notoriously difficult and require great honesty with oneself. As Hannah Arendt has shown with regard to Adolf Eichmann and the other employees of the Nazi extermination camps, it is easy to disguise the responsibility for even the cold-blooded murder of thousands with the excuse, "I only work here." The psychologists Ann Colby and William Damon have described many individuals who have gone to extreme lengths to make their work meaningful. People who have left a normal existence in order to dedicate themselves to making a difference in the lives of others. One such person is Susie Valdez, who was drifting from one low-paying and boring service job to another on the West Coast with no prospects for anything better. Then during a visit to Mexico, she saw the garbage hills at the outskirts of Ciudad Juarez, where hundreds of homeless urchins survived by scavenging. Susie found here people who were even more desperate than she was, and discovered she had the power to show the children a better way to live. She built a mission house among the refuse, started a school and a clinic, and became known as the Queen of the Dumps. Short of making such a dramatic switch, there are a great many ways to make one's job more meaningful by adding value to it. A supermarket clerk who pays genuine attention to customers, a physician concerned about the total well-being of patients rather than specific symptoms only, or a news reporter who considers truth at least as important as the sensational interest when writing a story, can transform a routine job with ephemeral consequences into one that makes a difference. With increasing specialization, most occupational activities have become repetitive and one-dimensional. It is difficult to build a positive self-concept if all one does is stock supermarket aisles or fill out forms from morning to night. By taking the whole context of the activity into account and understanding the impact of one's actions on the whole, a trivial job can turn into a memorable performance that leaves the world in a better shape than it was before. Like everyone else, I could make a long list of encounters with workers who, in addition to doing their job, help reduce entropy around them. A service station attendant who fixed a windshield wiper with a smile and refused to be paid for such a minor effort. A real estate salesman who kept helping years after he sold the house. A flight attendant who was willing to stay after the rest of the crew left the airport to locate a missing wallet. In all such cases, the value of the job performance was increased because the worker was willing to invest extra psychic energy into it, and thus was able to withdraw from it additional meaning. But the meaning we derive from a job does not come free. As these examples show, one must do some thinking and caring beyond what the job description calls for, and this, in turn, requires additional attention, which, as has been said again and again, is the most precious resource we have. A similar argument holds for turning a job that lacks challenge and variety into one that satisfies our need for novelty and achievement. Here, too, one needs to expend additional psychic energy to reap the desired benefits. Without some effort, a dull job will just stay dull. The basic solution is quite simple. It involves paying close attention to each step involved in the job and then asking, is this step necessary? Who needs it? If it is really necessary, can it be done better, faster, more efficiently? And what additional steps could make my contribution more valuable? Our attitude to work usually involves spending a lot of effort trying to cut corners and do as little as possible. But that is a short-sighted strategy. If one spent the same amount of attention trying to find ways to accomplish more on the job, one would enjoy working more and probably be more successful at it, too. Some of the most important discoveries come about when the scientist, paying attention to a routine process, notices something new and unusual that needs to be explained. Wilhelm C. Röntgen discovered radiation when he noticed that some photographic negatives showed signs of being exposed even in the absence of light. Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin when he noticed that bacterial cultures were less dense on dishes that had not been cleaned and were moldy. Rosalind Yalow discovered the radioimmunoassay technique after she noticed that diabetics absorbed insulin slower than normal patients, instead of faster, as it had been assumed. In all these cases, and the records of science are full of similar ones, a humdrum event is transformed into a major discovery that changes the way we live because someone paid more attention to it than the situation seemed to warrant. If Archimedes, lowering himself into the bath, had only thought, "Darn, I got the floor wet again, what will the missus say?" humankind might have had to wait another few hundred years to understand the principle of fluid displacement. As Yalow describes her own experience, something comes up, and you recognize that it has happened. Sounds simple, but most of us are usually too distracted to recognize when something happens. As minute changes can result in great discoveries, so small adjustments can turn a routine job one dreads into a professional performance one can look forward to with anticipation each morning. First, one must pay attention so as to understand thoroughly what is happening and why. Second, it is essential not to accept passively that what is happening is the only way to do the job. Then one needs to entertain alternatives and to experiment with them until a better way is found. When employees are promoted to more challenging positions, it is usually because they followed these steps in their previous jobs. But even if no one else notices, the worker who uses psychic energy this way will have a more satisfying job. One of the clearest examples I have ever seen was when I did research in a factory where audio-visual equipment was being assembled on a production line. Most of the workers on the line were bored and looked down on their job as something beneath them. Then I met Rico, who had a completely different take on what he was doing. He actually thought his job was difficult, and that it took great skill to do it. It turned out he was right. Although he had to do the same sort of boring task as everyone else, he had trained himself to do it with the economy and the elegance of a virtuoso. About 400 times each day, a movie camera would stop at his station, and Rico had 43 seconds to check out whether the sound system met specifications. Over a period of years, experimenting with tools and patterns of motion, he had been able to reduce the average time it took him to check each camera to 28 seconds. He was as proud of this accomplishment as an Olympic athlete would be if, after the same amount of years spent preparing, he could break the 44-second mark in the 400-meter sprint. Rico did not get a medal for his record, and reducing the time to do his job did not improve production because the line still kept moving at the old speed. But he loved the exhilaration of using his skills fully. He said, "It's better than anything else, a whole lot better than watching TV." And because he sensed that he was getting close to his limit in the present job, he was taking evening courses for a diploma that would open up new options for him in electronic engineering. It will come as no surprise that the same type of approach is needed for solving the problem of stress at work, since stress is detrimental to achieving flow. In common usage, the word stress applies both to the tension we feel and to its external causes. This ambiguity leads to the erroneous assumption that external stress must inevitably result in psychic discomfort. But here again, there is no one-to-one relation between the objective and the subjective. External stress, which to avoid confusion we might call strain, need not lead to negative experiences. It is true that people feel anxious when they perceive the challenges in a situation as far exceeding their skills and that they want to avoid anxiety at all cost, but the perception of challenges and skills rests on a subjective evaluation that is amenable to change. At work, there are as many sources of strain as there are in life itself. Unexpected crises, high expectations, insoluble problems of all sorts. How does one keep them from becoming stressful? A first step consists in establishing priorities among the demands that crowd into consciousness. The more responsibilities one has, the more essential it becomes to know what is truly important and what is not. Successful people often make lists, or flowcharts, of all the things they have to do and quickly decide which tasks they can delegate, or forget about, and which ones they have to tackle personally and in what order. Sometimes this activity takes the form of a ritual, which like all ritual serves in part as a reassurance that things are under control. John Reed, CEO of Citicorp, spends time each morning setting his priorities. "I am a great lister," he says. "I have 20 lists of things to do all the time. If I ever have 5 free minutes, I sit and make lists of things that I should be worrying about." But it is not necessary to be so systematic. Some people trust their memory and experience and make their choices more intuitively. The important thing is to develop a personal strategy to produce some kind of order. After priorities are set, some people will confront first the easiest tasks on the list and clear the desk for the more difficult ones. Others proceed in reverse order because they feel that after dealing with the tough items, the easier ones will take care of themselves. Both strategies work, but for different people. What's important is for each person to find out which one fits best. Being able to create order among various demands that crowd upon consciousness will go a long way toward preventing stress. The next step is to match one's skills with whatever challenges have been identified. There will be tasks we feel incompetent to deal with. Can they be delegated to someone else? Can you learn the skills required in time? Can you get help? Can the task be performed or broken up into simpler parts? Usually the answer to one of these questions will provide a solution that transforms a potentially stressful situation into a flow experience. None of this will happen, however, if one responds to the strain passively, like a rabbit frozen by the headlights of an oncoming car. One must invest attention into the ordering of tasks, into the analysis of what is required to complete them, and into the strategies of solution. Only by exercising control can stress be avoided, and while everyone has the psychic energy needed to cope with strain, few learn to use it effectively. The careers of creative individuals give some of the best examples of how one can shape work into one's own requirements. Most creative persons don't follow a career laid out for them, but invent their job as they go along. Artists invent their own style of painting, composers their own musical styles. Creative scientists develop new fields of science and make it possible for their successors to have careers in them. There were no radiologists before Röntgen, and there was no nuclear medicine before Yallo and her colleagues pioneered that field. There were no auto workers before entrepreneurs like Henry Ford built up the first production lines. Obviously, very few people can start entirely new lines of work. Most of us will follow the job description of conventional careers. But even the most routine job can benefit from the kind of transforming energy that creative individuals bring to what they do. George Klein, a tumor biologist who heads a renowned research department at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, illustrates how well such people approach their work. Klein likes what he does enormously, yet there are two aspects of his job that he hates. One is waiting at airport terminals, which he has to do often because of his very busy schedule of international meetings. The other aspect he detests is writing the inevitable grant proposals to government agencies that provide the funding for his research team. These two boring tasks were depleting his psychic energy and building up dissatisfaction with his work, yet they could not be avoided. Then Klein had a flash of inspiration. What if he combined these two tasks? If he could write his grant applications while waiting for planes, he would save half the time previously devoted to boring tasks. To implement this strategy, he bought the best pocket tape recorder he could find and started to dictate grant proposals while waiting or inching forward at airport customs lines. These aspects of his job are still objectively what they were before, but because he took control, Klein transformed them almost into a game. It is now a challenge to dictate as much as possible while waiting, and instead of feeling that he is wasting time at a boring task, he feels energized. On every airline flight, one sees dozens of men and women working on their laptop computers, or adding columns of figures, or highlighting technical articles they are reading. Does it mean that, like George Klein, they feel energized by having combined travel with work? It depends on whether they feel obliged to do so, or whether they have adopted this strategy to save time or gain efficiency. In the first case, working on the plane is likely to be stressful rather than flow-producing. If it is something one feels one has to do, it would perhaps be better to look at the clouds below, read a magazine, or chat with a fellow passenger instead. Besides work, the other major area that impacts on the quality of life is the kind of relationships we have. And there is often a conflict between these two, so that a person who loves work may neglect family and friends, and vice versa. The inventor Jacob Rabinow, in describing how his wife often feels ignored, echoes what all people devoted to their work would say. I'm so involved in an idea I'm working on, I get so carried away, that I'm all by myself. I'm not listening to what anybody says. You're not paying attention to anybody, and you tend to drift away from people. It could be that if I were not an inventor, but had a routine job, I'd spend more time at home and pay more attention to them. So maybe people who don't like their jobs love their home more. There is quite a bit of truth to this remark, and the reason is simple. Given that attention is a limited resource, when one goal takes up all your psychic energy, there is none left over. Nevertheless, it is difficult to be happy if one neglects either one of these two dimensions. Many people married to their jobs are aware of it and find ways of compensating either by choosing an understanding spouse or by being very careful in rationing their attention. Linus Pauling was very open about this issue. He said, I was fortunate, I believe, that my wife felt her duty in life and her pleasure in life would come from her family, her husband and children, and that the way she could best contribute would be to see to it that I would not be bothered by the problems involved in the household, that she would settle all of these problems in such a way that I could devote all of my time to my work. But few people, and especially few women, could call themselves as fortunate as Pauling in this respect. A more realistic venue is to find ways to balance the meaningfulness of the rewards we get from work and from relationships. For despite the fact that almost everyone claims the family is the most important concern in their lives, very few, especially few men, behave as if this were the case. True, most married men are convinced that their lives are dedicated to their family, and from a material standpoint this might be true. But it takes more than food in the fridge and 2 cars in the garage to keep a family going. A group of people is kept together by 2 kinds of energy. Material energy, provided by food, warmth, physical care, and money, and the psychic energy of people investing attention in each other's goals. Unless parents and children share ideas, emotions, activities, memories, and dreams, their relationship will survive only because it satisfies material needs. As a psychic entity, it will exist only at the most primitive level. Amazingly enough, many people refuse to see this point. The most widespread attitude seems to be that as long as material needs are provided for, a family will take care of itself. It will be a warm, harmonious, permanent refuge in a cold and dangerous world. It is very common to meet successful men in their late 40s and 50s who are stunned when their wives suddenly leave or their children get into serious trouble. Didn't they always love their family? Didn't they invest all their energy to make them happy? True, they never had more than a few minutes each day to talk, but how could they have done otherwise with all the demands from the job? The usual assumption we make is that to achieve career success requires a great deal of continuous investment of thought and energy. Family relationships, by contrast, are natural, so they demand little mental effort. A spouse will continue to be supportive. Children will keep minding their parents, more or less, because that is how families are supposed to be. Businessmen know that even the most successful company needs constant attention, because external and internal conditions are always changing and need to be adjusted to. Entropy is a constant factor, and if it is not attended to, the company will dissolve. Yet many of them assume that families are somehow different. Entropy cannot touch them, and so they are immune to change. There are some grounds for such a belief when families are kept together by external bonds of social control, and by internal bonds of religious or ethical commitment. Contractual obligations have the advantage of making relationships predictable and saving energy by excluding options and the need for constant negotiation. When marriage was supposed to be forever, it did not need constant effort to maintain. Now that the integrity of the family has become a matter of personal choice, it cannot survive except through the regular infusion of psychic energy. The new kind of family is very vulnerable unless it can provide intrinsic rewards to its members. When family interaction provides flow, it is in the self-interest of everyone to continue the relationship. Yet because families are taken so much for granted, few people have learned to transform the old ties that bound because of external obligations into new ones that hold because of the enjoyment they provide. When parents come home exhausted from their jobs, they hope that being with the family will be an effortless, relaxing, invigorating experience. But to find flow in family relaxations requires as much skill as in any other complex activity. The Canadian author Robertson Davies describes one of the reasons his marriage of 54 years has been so rewarding. He said, "Shakespeare has always played an extraordinary role in our marriage as a source of quotations and jokes and references which are fathomless. I feel that I am uncommonly lucky because we've had such a terribly good time together. It's always been an adventure and we haven't come to the end yet. We haven't finished talking, and I swear that conversation is more important to marriage than sex." For Davies and his wife, the skill that made joint flow possible was a common love and knowledge of literature. But one could substitute almost anything for Shakespeare. A couple in their 60s revived their relationship by starting to run marathons together. Others have done it through travel, gardening, or breeding dogs. When people pay attention to each other, or to the same activity together, the chances of flow binding the family increases. Parenting is supposed to be one of the most rewarding experiences in life, but it isn't unless one approaches it with the same attention as one would a sport or an artistic performance. In a study of flow in motherhood, Maria Allison and Margaret Carlyle Duncan describe several examples of how the psychic energy invested in a child's growth can produce enjoyment in parenting. Here, a mother describes the times she achieves flow. "When I'm working with my daughter, when she's discovering something new, a new cookie recipe that she has accomplished, that she has made herself, an artistic work that she has done that she's proud of. Her reading is one thing that she's really into, and we read together. She reads to me, and I read to her, and that's a time when I sort of lose touch with the rest of the world. I'm totally absorbed in what I'm doing." To experience such simple pleasures of parenting, one has to pay attention, to know what the child is proud of, what she is into. Then one has to devote more attention to share those activities with her. Only when there is harmony between the goals of the participants, when everyone is investing psychic energy into a joint goal, does being together become enjoyable. The same holds true for any other type of interaction. For instance, when there is reason to think that we are appreciated, job satisfaction is usually high, whereas the greatest source of stress in the workplace is the feeling that no one is interested in supporting our goals. Infighting among coworkers, inability to communicate with superiors and subordinates are the bane of most jobs. The roots of interpersonal conflict are often an excessive concern for oneself and an inability to pay attention to the needs of others. It is sad to see how often people ruin a relationship because they refuse to recognize that they could serve their own interests best by helping others achieve theirs. In American corporate culture, the hero is a ruthless, competitive person with a huge ego. Unfortunately, some top entrepreneurs and CEOs do conform to that image. Yet it is also reassuring that aggressive selfishness is not the only path to success. In fact, in most stable and well-run companies, leaders try to promote subordinates who don't invest all their psychic energy in self-advancement, but use some of it to the advancement of corporate goals. They know that if top management is filled with greedy egotists, the company will eventually suffer for it. Keith is one example of many managers I have met who spent a decade or more desperately trying to impress their superiors in order to get promoted. He worked 70 hours and more a week, even when he knew it was not necessary, neglecting his family and his own personal growth in the process. To increase his competitive advantage, Keith hoarded all the credit he could for his accomplishments, even if it meant making colleagues and subordinates look bad. But despite all his efforts, he kept being passed over for important promotions. Finally, Keith resigned himself to having reached the ceiling of his career and decided to find his rewards elsewhere. He spent more time with the family, took up a hobby, and became involved in community activities. Because he was no longer struggling so hard, his behavior on the job became more relaxed, less selfish, more objective. In fact, he began to act more like a leader whose personal agenda takes second place to the well-being of the company. Now the general manager was fully impressed. This is the kind of person we need at the helm. Keith was promoted soon after he let go of his ambition. His case is by no means rare. To be trusted in a position of leadership, it helps to advance other people's goals, as well as one's own. Congenial relations on the job are important, but the quality of life depends also on innumerable encounters with other people outside of work. This is not as simple as it sounds. Each time we stop to speak to another person, it takes up some psychic energy, and we become vulnerable to being ignored, ridiculed, or exploited. Some cultures develop their own peculiar patterns for facilitating social interaction. In groups where kinship is the main principle of organization, you may be expected to joke with your sister-in-law, but never talk to your mother-in-law. In traditional hierarchical societies, like that of ancient China, complex forms of greetings and conventional conversational formulae ensured that people could communicate without having to waste time figuring out what to say and how to say it. Americans have perfected a form of easy conversation that fits the mobile and democratic nature of our society. Its superficial heartiness, however, is just as formulaic as those of an African tribe. To gain something from talking to a person, one has to learn something new, either in knowledge or emotions. That requires both participants to concentrate on the interaction, which in turn demands psychic energy that generally we are unwilling to invest. Yet a genuine flow of conversation is one of the highlights of existence. The secret of starting a good conversation is really quite simple. The first step is to find out what the other person's goals are. What is he interested in at the moment? What is she involved in? What has he or she accomplished, or is trying to accomplish? If any of this sounds worth pursuing, the next step is to utilize one's own experience or expertise on the topics raised by the other person, without trying to take over the conversation, but developing it jointly. A good conversation is like a jam session in jazz, where one starts with conventional elements and then introduces spontaneous variations that create an exciting new composition. If work and relationships are able to provide flow, the quality of life is bound to improve. But there are no gimmicks, no easy shortcuts. It takes a total commitment to a fully experienced life, one in which no opportunities are left unexplored and no potential undeveloped to achieve excellence. The organization of the self that makes this possible is the topic of the next chapter.